What you're about to witness is the most shocking confrontation between law enforcement and judicial authority ever captured on camera. When this arrogant 38-year-old police officer walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom and made the fatal mistake of arguing with the judge about the law itself, what happened next would not only destroy his career, but become a legendary lesson about respect, authority, and why some battles should never be fought. This story shows us what happens when badge-wearing arrogance meets decades of judicial wisdom. That morning, his action was a traffic stop. A simple speeding ticket, a kid, maybe 19, driving too fast on an empty road. It should have been routine. But the kid was mouthy, arrogant in that way only a teenager who thinks he knows everything can be. He argued. He quoted some statute he'd half remembered from the internet, his voice dripping with a condescension that grated on every one of Edward's nerves. Edward didn't just write the ticket. He wrote it with a fury, his pen digging into the paper. He amped up the charge, making it a little more serious, a little more costly. It was a power move, a way of saying, "You don't get to talk to me like that. Out here, I am the law." It was in that moment, as he handed the ticket through the window to the stunned kid, that the seed was planted. The belief solidified in his gut. He knew better. He was the one on the front lines, and everyone else, especially those who wanted to debate the fine print, were just spectators in the game of real life. So when Edward Jack himself received a summons, a parking ticket he'd genuinely forgotten about, one that had snowballed with late fees, he didn't see it as a simple bureaucratic oversight. He saw it as an insult, a piece of paper challenging his authority, his understanding of the system. He could have just paid the fine online, but he didn't. He decided to go to court, to fight it, not because of the money, but because of the principle. He was Officer Edward Jack. He enforced the law. The law didn't inconvenience him. The day of the hearing, he put on his uniform with a sense of purpose, not of duty, but of defiance. The badge was polished to a brilliant shine, a shield of righteousness. He walked into the courthouse with the same swagger he carried onto a crime scene. This was his territory, his world. He nodded at the bailiffs, men he knew. He felt a quiet confidence. He'd testify, explain the situation, and the judge, whoever it was, would surely see the logic and dismiss it. It was a formality, a conversation between professionals. But the courtroom of Judge Frank Caprio is a different kind of place. If you've ever seen his show, you know. It's not the cold, intimidating chamber you see in dramas. There's a humanness to it. The walls seem to have absorbed decades of anxiety, hope, and petty grievances. And Judge Caprio himself, sitting up on the bench, isn't a distant, robed monarch. He has this weary kindness in his eyes, a face that has seen every possible excuse and every genuine hardship. He doesn't just process cases, he listens to people. He operates on a scale of fairness that sometimes exists just outside the strictest letter of the law. He understands that the law is a framework for a society of people, not just a checklist for punishment. Edward took a seat in the gallery, waiting for his name to be called. He watched the proceedings with a growing sense of impatience. He saw Caprio listen patiently to an elderly woman who couldn't afford her ticket, her voice trembling as she explained her fixed income. And the judge, he didn't just dismiss it. He talked to her. He asked about her life. He found a community service option she could manage. Edward shifted in his hard wooden seat. To him, this was a waste of time. This was coddling. This was the soft, interpretive version of the law that made his job on the street harder. If the law said you pay a fine, you pay the fine. All this talking, this empathy, it felt like a weakness. Finally, the bailiff called. Edward Jack. He stood up, his uniform crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He walked to the defendant's table, a slight, confident smile on his face. He was one of them. This would be over in seconds. Judge Caprio looked down at the file, then over his glasses at Edward. "Officer Jack," he began, his voice calm, familiar. "I see here you're contesting a parking violation from, looks like about 9 months ago." "That's correct, Your Honor," Edward said, his voice clear and loud, carrying across the room. "It was an oversight. I was on duty, involved in a felony stop. It simply slipped my mind. I believe, given the circumstances, a dismissal is in order." He said it not as a request, but as a statement of fact. He expected a nod, a case dismissed, and a shared chuckle about the hassles of the job. But Judge Caprio didn't dismiss it. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "An oversight," he repeated, not unkindly. "I understand, it happens. But the law, Officer Jack, it doesn't really have a clause for oversight, does it? The fees accrued because time passed. The system, it just kept ticking along." A flicker of irritation crossed Edward's face. This wasn't going according to the script in his head. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, the phrase sounding anything but respectful. "I was enforcing the law. I was preventing a real crime. I think that should take precedence over a parked car." The air in the room changed. It was subtle, but it was there. The gentle conversational tone Caprio had used with the previous defendants cooled by several degrees. The judge's eyes, those famously empathetic eyes, narrowed just a fraction. He was no longer looking at a man with a problem. He was looking at a man with an attitude. "Officer Jack," Caprio said, his voice still, measured, but now with an edge of steel underneath. "I appreciate your service, we all do. But in this courtroom, a parking violation is the real crime we're dealing with. You're not on the street right now. You're a citizen before the bench. The law, as it's written, applies to you in the same way it applies to the elderly woman who was here before you. And the same way it will apply to the person who comes after you." This was the moment. This was the fork in the road. A wiser man would have heard the warning. A humbler man would have nodded, accepted the gentle admonishment, and maybe even agreed to pay a reduced fine. But Edward Jack was not that man. The callus around his ego was too thick. The arrogance, fed by a dozen years of being the one in charge, boiled over. He saw this not as a correction, but as a challenge, a personal one. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The polished badge on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a tiny, hard star of defiance. "Your Honor," he said, and his voice lost its professional cadence, slipping into something colder, more confrontational. "With all due respect, I think there's a disconnect here, a fundamental disconnect. I'm out there every day, applying the law in real time. I have to make split-second decisions that people in more comfortable positions get to second-guess for months. I know the law. I live it. So for me to be standing here, being lectured about the importance of a parking ticket, it feels like a hypocrisy. It feels like you're not understanding the practical application of the law versus the theoretical version you practice up there." The courtroom was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The bailiffs stopped shifting their weight. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. Every person in that room was holding their breath. No one talked to Judge Caprio like that, ever. Judge Frank Caprio slowly removed his glasses. He placed them carefully on the bench in front of him. He looked at Edward Jack, not as a judge to a defendant, not even as an authority figure to a subordinate. He looked at him as one man to another. And in his eyes, there was no anger. Not yet. There was something far more dangerous. A profound, deep-seated disappointment. The tension was no longer about a parking ticket. It was about to become a lesson that would shatter a man's entire world. And we haven't even gotten to the part where he destroys his badge. That silence in the courtroom stretched, becoming a physical thing, thick and heavy. It was the quiet before the storm, the moment the ground stops shaking just before the full force of the earthquake hits. Every eye was locked on Judge Caprio. The folks in the gallery who'd come in with their own little troubles, their own speeding tickets and noise complaints, had forgotten all about them. They were witnessing something raw, something real, a crack in the usual order of things. And Edward Jack, he stood there, his knuckles white where he gripped the table, his chest puffed out, still riding that wave of self-righteousness. He probably thought he was winning. He had no idea he was already standing in the ruins of his own career. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, precise, and they cut deeper than any shout ever could. "Officer Jack," he began, and the title sounded less like a formality and more like a pointed reminder. "You speak of a disconnect. You speak of the theoretical law versus the practical law. You stand there in the uniform that the people of this city trust, and you tell me that your understanding, your personal interpretation, supersedes the very system you swore an oath to uphold." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle on Edward's shoulders. You could see the first flicker of doubt in Edward's eyes, a tiny crack in the armor. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd expected anger, a shouting match he felt he could win. He wasn't prepared for this calm, surgical dismantling of his entire argument. "Let me be perfectly clear," Caprio continued, his gaze unwavering. "There is no your law. There is no my law. There is only the law. It is a single, consistent entity. The moment we, any of us, begin to believe that our experience, our position, grants us a special license to bend it or ignore it, is the moment the entire foundation of justice begins to crumble. That elderly woman you saw before you, the law applies to her. The teenager you pulled over for speeding, the law applies to him. And you, Officer Jack, in this courtroom right now, the law applies to you. That is not a theory. That is the bedrock of this country. And your badge," he said, his eyes dropping for a split second to the gleaming shield on Edward's chest. "That badge is not a crown. It is not a free pass. It is a symbol of your duty to uphold that very principle. And right now, you are not upholding it. You are trampling on it." Edward tried to speak. "Your Honor, But Caprio held up a single hand, a gesture so final, it slammed the door shut on any further argument. "No," the judge said, his voice gaining a little more volume, fueled by a righteous fire. "You have had your say. You have stood in my courtroom and argued that your practical application of the law is more valid than the process that protects every single citizen from the whims of those in power. Do you not see the terrifying arrogance in that? Do you not understand that what you are describing is not law enforcement? It is tyranny. It is you, and you alone, deciding what is right and what is wrong based on your mood, on whether you like the person you're dealing with, on whether they've shown you what you deem to be respect." He leaned forward, now his hands flat on the bench. "You mentioned the real crime you were preventing when you accrued this ticket. Tell me, Officer Jack, if you had pulled over a citizen that day, and they had given you the exact speech you just gave me, if they had told you that their personal work, their important job, meant the traffic laws didn't really apply to them, what would you have done? Would you have nodded, understood their practical situation, and let them go? Or would you have written the ticket because the law is the law, and no one is above it?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, devastating trap. Edward's face went pale. He had no answer, because they both knew the answer. He would have written the ticket. He would have written it with a sneer for their entitlement. The hypocrisy was so glaring, so absolute, it was almost painful to look at. The entire performance, his whole indignant stance, collapsed under the weight of that single, simple question. The armor was gone, and what was left was just a man being exposed. And then came the moment that would define this clip forever. The moment that would destroy his badge forever. Judge Caprio looked at Edward, and there was no triumph in his eyes, only a profound, weary sadness. "A badge," he said, his voice dropping back to that conversational, almost intimate tone, "is a piece of metal, but what it represents is sacred. It represents the public's trust. It is a promise that you will serve and protect everyone equally, under the law. When you put it on, you are supposed to check your personal feelings, your arrogance, your ego at the door. You are supposed to become a servant of the law, not its master." He took a deep breath. "Officer Edward Jack, based on your statements here today, your clear and demonstrated belief that you are above the very laws you are charged with enforcing, I find that you are in contempt of this court. But more importantly, I find that you are in contempt of the principles your badge is supposed to stand for." He turned to the court clerk. "The parking violation is upheld. All fines and fees are to be paid in full." Then he turned back to Edward. The final blow. "And furthermore," Judge Caprio said, his words slow and deliberate, "I am immediately suspending your powers of arrest. I am placing a call, the moment this hearing is adjourned, to your Chief of Police and the Internal Affairs Division. I will be recommending, in the strongest possible terms, that your badge be taken from you permanently, and that you undergo a complete psychological re-evaluation to determine your fitness for duty. The badge you wear today, Officer Jack, is a lie. It no longer represents what it is supposed to represent. And in the eyes of this court, it is already destroyed." It was over, just like that. Edward Jack didn't move. He just stood there, his body rigid, his eyes wide and unseeing. The air had been sucked out of him. The confrontation wasn't a battle of wills. It was an education. It was a master class in the difference between power and authority. Judge Caprio had the authority, rooted in decades of wisdom and a genuine respect for the law. Edward Jack had only power, and it had proven to be as fragile as glass. You could see the realization dawning on his face, slow and horrifying. It wasn't about the ticket. It was never about the ticket. It was about him, about the man he had become, the arrogant, entitled man who had mistaken his uniform for a throne. He didn't argue. He didn't say another word. He just turned, slowly, and walked out of the courtroom. His shoulders, which had been so squared and proud on the way in, were now slumped. The polished badge on his chest didn't look shiny anymore. It just looked like a piece of cheap, heavy metal, a weight dragging him down. The destruction wasn't a physical act of tearing it off. It was far more complete than that. Judge Caprio had stripped it of all its meaning, all its honor, right in front of everyone. He had shown the whole world that the man wearing it was unworthy of what it symbolized. And in doing so, he had destroyed it more effectively than if he had taken a hammer to it himself. The story of Edward Jack is a cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that no matter who you are, what uniform you wear, or how much experience you think you have, the law is a constant. It is the great equalizer. Arrogance has no place in its presence. True authority comes not from a badge, but from humility, from respect, and from an unwavering commitment to justice, not just for others, but for yourself. This is more than just a viral video. It's a lesson we all need to remember. If you found this story as powerful as I did, if you believe in the principles of fairness and justice that Judge Caprio so beautifully embodies, then do me a favor. Share this video. Let's get this lesson out there. Because the world needs more reminders of what true authority looks like and what happens when arrogance tries to challenge it. Thanks for watching.
We continue to remember America's nicest judge, Frank Caprio.
Frank Caprio.
Frank Caprio.
Frank Caprio, known to a lot of folks as the nicest judge in the world.